welcome back to another VMware Cloud Customer Success Team webinar series. Today, we're going to go over a little bit of an HCX update. This product is ever changing. They're making constant updates to it, and we've done quite a few webinars on this. So this one's going to be kind of covering some of the newer stuff and going over a little bit what's new use cases and stuff like that. If you want some more content and context, there are some more videos on our YouTube channel as well, which is linked at the bottom of our Twitch page, or I can put out the link. But just search Customer Success VMware Cloud. You'll find us on YouTube. Today, joined, thankfully, by Michael Kolos. Michael Kolos is a staff solutions architect, or staff customer success architect on the customer success team. Incredibly smart guy. I hit him up last minute to kind of put this together. So everybody's muted by default, but we do want to keep this interactive, so you can use the Q&A to ask any questions at any time, and we'll get to it. Or if you're watching on Twitch, you can ask in Twitch chat, and we'll get to it as well. So with that, I'll hand over to Michael. Michael, want to do a little bit of an introduction of yourself, and then you can get right into it.
Sure. I don't know if I could describe anything I do any better than you just did, but just to give you an idea of what we do in customer success as a customer success architect is we work with typically the largest deployments of VMware Cloud on AWS customers to help them basically get through all their technical questions and ensure that they're doing designs that are recommended and approved and meet all the requirements. HCX is very much a part of what we do. It's a pretty integral component to VMware Cloud on AWS. It's used by a lot of our customers to help them migrate their workloads in and get them through the transition from their current environment, whether it's on-prem or another managed cloud solution that they're moving to VMware Cloud on AWS to, or wherever they're from. There's certainly a lot of options that HCX can help with. And we also have some use cases where customers keep it enabled for a more hybrid model where you're constantly moving workloads, so it's not a one-time migration. The majority of customers do keep a single, or I shouldn't say a single site, but they don't actively move workloads between sites on a regular basis. Some do. This is what we call the hybrid. And HCX is in the middle of everything, literally. It's the special sauce, as we call it, that allows you to provide the network connectivity that supports that hybrid networking for your VM, so that they can move without having to modify applications or guest OS infrastructure, no IP changes. And it also has a lot of amazing migration options to help move the workloads in coordinated fashion. So we'll go over some of those options. Some of them are a little newer, and we'll talk through how you would set it up. What do you need to think about? How do you do migrations with it, essentially? Take questions as we go. So slide I have up is just really showing some of the interaction points. There's support for all the way back to vSphere 5. So if you got some legacy environments you want to move to a more modern cloud environment, that HCX supports that. There are some limits around what types of migrations you can do with some of the older versions. They don't have the same capabilities, but you can at least get your workloads moved and extend your networks from the majority of them. Once you get to 5.5, update 3, I believe it is, you can start to do pretty much the full suite of migrations. So it's really only for the really older, at this point, quite legacy 5.0 and earlier 5.5 environments that you're somewhat restricted. But once you get past that to 5.5 update 3, you're pretty much in the clear. And that's actually the case for a lot of key features in general, beyond just HCX. It's just where the features that got to. I do want to take a little bit of time here, since we're talking about versions, is to talk about something that came out relatively recently, and that's the some of the security patches that have been out there for these Intel CPU vulnerabilities, the Spectre, and what's the other? meltdown series of vulnerabilities. And the reason that is, we see this come up often, is that sometimes patches will be applied at different levels. So customers will update their vCenter with the patches that include the capabilities for that those vulnerability patches, but they won't update the ESX host. And the problem with that is one of the ways that these are mitigated are to add some additional CPU flags that get exposed. And as a result, once they're added, HCX with its ability to migrate between versions, it does a type of per VM EVC, which is basically masking flags from the guest OS VMs that are present on the physical CPU, so that they have more compatibility. So you can move between different versions of CPU, so that everything doesn't have to have exactly the same CPU support. We run into some issues with the patches for the Spectre meltdown. So if like I said, if you patch your vCenter now has this list of additional flags that it's aware of. If you haven't patched your ESX host, then it doesn't have those flags, and so they can't be masked because they're not present. And what happens is HCX queries vCenter, finds out what flags you know, and it tries to apply them, and then we get a mismatch. And so just it's important to keep your vCenter and your ESX host in sync, both on-prem and well, in the cloud we do it for you. And it's just specifically about these patches, these security patches. You want to have them patched on-prem. Um, it's usually okay if you consciously haven't patched them, but if you have updated your vCenter to a version that includes those, not your ESX host, you can run into some issues. So just in terms of compatibility, just wanted to get that one out there. So HCX, in a nutshell, there are basically three main components. We show fourth here. The fourth one is a bit of a subcomponent, but the main component starts with a manager. So each side gets a manager. In VMware Cloud on AWS, it's automatically deployed when you select to enable HCX on your SDDC. That's what we deploy. We deploy a manager. You then get to download an OVA of that, basically the same manager, but the on-prem version, and you deploy that in your own vCenter. Once you have that OVA deployed and you've given it an IP on your network, you pair it with the cloud manager, and that it forms your management plane, and it allows the two sides
Just
to
a quick
talk.
question for you, Michael. Did you change your screen? Because we're just still seeing the presentation.
Oh, sorry, I did, and it didn't update on the other screen.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we can see what you're talking about.
Sorry about that. Thanks for pointing that out. The
There
build
we go. Yes, perfect.
Okay, I don't really want to do the build. I just want to show you the components here. So let me. Sorry, somehow I have two versions of PowerPoint running that are not talking to each other. All right. So this is where I was at here. The manager gets paired with the cloud manager, and this is your management plane. And then once you create that secure pairing, which works over HTTPS or TLS port 443, so it's generally pretty easy to allow that connectivity. You only need to allow outbound connectivity from your on-prem. It does support going through a proxy. Also want to draw attention here to these two URLs that are internet URLs, public URLs, that the manager does need to talk to. And sometimes this is a bit of a challenge. You don't want to resolve them to IPs and allow them because they're content engine hosted. They may change IPs fairly regularly. But the purpose of those two IPs they're twofold. There's one is to get updates, and two is to handle the registration and licensing. There's a phone home and a check-in. So you need to have that connectivity on an ongoing basis. As I mentioned, it does support using a proxy, so you can add a proxy server to your enterprise manager with or without authentication. And if you can't allow the manager out because of your security policy, then using a proxy is the way to go, because you do need to allow based on the URL itself. Otherwise, you'll tend to run into problems down the road. And the last thing you want is to have be in the middle of a migration and suddenly have your manager tell you that your license is expiring and you can't contact the license server, or you need an update and you're not able to get it. And, better to deal with that in your setup phase. So once you have this pairing relationship, you'll see. Let's see if I can show you what a pair looks like. Just let me load this on the screen. Okay, so let me give you a UI clip here. So this is just a lab environment, and once you get to the HCX screen, so it installs a plugin in your vCenter, which you can access through your add-ons in the main menu. You can see the site pairs. So here we've got, well, in this case, the cloud is actually my on-prem. It's just what we've named it, and we've got our local. Sorry, this is showing the name of the. This is the cloud. I apologize. That's the name of our cloud SDDC. And so we've got a pair between our on-prem with its IP and the public IP of the cloud, which in this case is in our Oregon. And our data center here, physical data center, is not too far away. So this is what you see when you get that successful pairing. It shows you the connected icon, and you see everything green. You could edit it, disconnect. The pairing is very simple. You give it the URL. It'll prompt you for the certificate. It should be trusted because it's signed by a trusted CA. And you enter the username and password, and it sets up that pairing, and that's pretty much it.
So there was a quick question that came in. It says, can you increase the size of the connection? So maybe you need to clarify that a little bit more of which connection.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just suggest that we hold off. So this is we'll talk about the connections a little bit later for the data part. This is simply forming a management connection. So at this point, there's no connection performance requirement really. It's just.
Oh, I think some of it was saying the screen is small, so maybe you can try maximizing
Oh,
that. Yeah.
sorry. Well, I'll come back to that. I'll try and stick to the slides for a bit. I just wanted to show what the pairing looks like, and I'll try
Okay.
to enlarge that. Yeah, it's just so there's the good and the bad of having a 4K screen. um, so let's talk about the next components. Once we have our site paired, we then have these three components. And really, like I said, there's two main components. The WAN optimization is essentially a sub-component of the interconnect. Each one of these components, the interconnect and the L2C network extension, are represent the key functions at HCX. So in order to allow this hybrid mobility or workload mobility without re-IPing, we need to create a network stretch or network extension. This is a layer 2 connection that's tunneled over layer 3, over internet essentially. And I say internet, but you could do it over a direct connect or internet. In either case, the connectivity between these appliance pairs is always encrypted with Suite B encryption, strong IPsec encryption. So everything's encrypted that goes over HCX. But the layer 2 stretch is what gives you that underlying common network, so that when a VM moves from one site to another, it doesn't change its IP and connectivity just works. Now, I say just works. It's not anything magical. It is a layer 2 tunnel, so there are some limitations on it, but it does provide pretty good throughput, up to 4 to 6 gigabits per second of throughput for your workloads. It does add a little bit of latency because you're now going over a WAN circuit rather than just a local area network in your data center. So if you have applications that are very chatty and highly dependent on extremely low latency, and there are some, you probably know if you have them because you probably had challenges with that with internal customers accessing those applications from different locations in the past. If you haven't, then it's probably likely that your applications are not that sensitive. Most are not, but there are some that are, and those are the ones you need to be cautious with. And we'll talk about that when we cover like how do you plan your moves and group your applications together. So once you get this layer 2 network extension stretched, then how do you move your workloads? And that's the workload migration is actually the job of the interconnect. So you create another peer for these two appliances with the interconnects. They also create fully encrypted, strong Suite B VPN tunnels between the two, all managed through the cloud manager. So you don't need to do that. You just need to provide it connectivity either over internet or direct connect, but not over another VPN, because then you're adding 2 layers of overhead, and you get subject to TCP and over TCP meltdown potential, and it's just not a supported configuration. So it needs to have direct internet connection or a pathway over your direct connect without going through another VPN. But it does meet all your security requirements. If you do require encryption, it will meet those requirements because it does create strong encryption. So the interconnect transfers the data for your workloads when you're moving them between sites. It will. There are a number of ways that it can transfer them. We'll cover those next section, but that is all done through those two appliances. So we have two separate sets of appliances for migration of VMs and for network connectivity. And the reason for that is so that you can scale them out differently. You can scale the network extensions up to one appliance per VLAN, or you can put up to 8 VLANs per appliance. So you can choose to scale as needed. If you have larger VLANs with a lot of VMs on them, you probably want to dedicate a pair of appliances for that particular VLAN. If it's if it's a small network with a couple of VMs or very low traffic, then you could probably get away with putting all 8 networks on a single pair of appliances to save those resources if they're not necessary. A couple of notes about the layer 2 extension. I mentioned we rate them at about 4 to 6 gigabits of bandwidth throughput. They do not use the WAN optimization. The WAN optimization, they do have certain functions that optimize. They're all internal optimization to simplify fragmentation and offload all that and optimize it as much as possible, as opposed to just sending traffic and relying on your TCP stack. They handle all that internally, but the WAN optimization appliance is specific to the HCX interconnect, which I'll show you here. They only talk for your replication traffic, and they do a lot of dedupe and caching to save bandwidth on your replication traffic, but they don't apply to the layer 2 networking. The other thing about the layer 2 networking is it relies on vSphere HA for availability. So if you lose the host that it's on, or the appliance crashes for some reason, then it will restart with vSphere HA, but you could experience an outage. They're usually pretty quick. The appliances have been optimized to boot up really quickly, but it still will take anywhere from 15 to 90 seconds to recover, depending on the type of failure and your environment and how busy everything is. So it's something to be aware of. That's the other point I want to add is when you extend a VLAN, you're actually extending that layer 2 segment VLAN. And we see sometimes customers have scenarios where they have multiple vCenters on-prem, but they're both sharing the same underlying networks. And they appear in vCenter as different port groups because each vCenter has its own distributed switches. You certainly do not want to stretch the same VLAN twice. So it's important if you have multiple vCenters, before you start stretching all of your networks in each site, that you understand which port groups in different vCenters are potentially the same VLAN. And you only need to stretch those from one, because it's the appliance stretches the entire layer 2 segment. You'll still have connectivity. You just have to choose which one you want to stretch it from. But it's important to understand that topology before you start to actually stretch any network.
So we just got a quick question here. Is it imperative to have NSX to use HCX?
So no, there's no requirement at all to have NSX. If you have NSX on-prem, HCX is able to extend NSX networks. So you can stretch your VXLAN networks, no problem. You just have to connect the HCX manager to your NSX manager, which is done similar to how when you register it to vCenter, when you deploy the OVA, you go into the web and you register it to your vCenter to get that plugin. There's also a spot where you can register it to NSX manager, and in that case, you can stretch your NSX logical segments. But you don't require it. You can stretch VLAN port groups. The only other requirement is that you need to have a distributed switch. You can't stretch networks off a standard switch today. I believe it is on their roadmap to get that feature enabled, but there are some limitations around it. So if you don't have a distributed switch in the environment, typically what we would recommend is take a small subset of hosts. Typically you want 2 hosts and put them in a separate cluster. You need at least 2 for some availability. And just create a separate distributed switch and map it to the same VLAN. So you may need to get some swing hardware just to run the layer 2 concentrators. And like I said, as long as it's on the same physical VLAN, underlying network VLAN, you can stretch it from any host. It just needs that network connectivity. It doesn't have to actually be on the host that your VMs are running on. It just has to be connected to that network. So it's easy enough to avoid impacting any production networks, especially if a site you're decommissioning. Just create a separate set of hosts, a small mini cluster to run your layer 2 network extensions. Create a VDS, map port groups to the VLANs that you need, and then stretch the networks with the layer 2 concentrators from that the mini cluster. All right, so I think I've covered pretty much everything on this slide already in the other discussions, but just showing you that the interconnect provides that path for VM mobility, and the network extension is a separate path, and it requires direct connection over the internet or your AWS Direct Connect in the case of VMware Cloud on AWS. So just a couple of other notes about some limitations that I won't go. So we do support multi-site terminology or topology. I mentioned, sometimes you have multiple vCenters. So there's a relationship between the HCX manager and vCenter. That's a one-to-one relationship. So for every vCenter where you have workloads you want to migrate, you do need a separate HCX manager. You can pair multiple HCX managers to a single HCX manager. So many to one or one to many. So if you're migrating to a single SDDC, there's one vCenter in the cloud in your cloud SDDC. You could pair multiple vCenters. They could be in multiple sites. You could pair them all to that single SDDC. Conversely, if you have multiple SDDCs and you want to have a vCenter going from on-prem to split workloads up into two different SDDCs, in that case, you would have one HCX manager in your on-prem vCenter, and it would be connecting with, you'd create two site pairings, one to each of your SDDCs, for example. So both those topologies are supported, and they give you flexibility in how you're going to migrate your workloads and where you're going to migrate them. The main thing is that the ratio of one vCenter to one HCX manager, similar to how NSX works.
So we just got another quick question here. So what about vCenters in linked mode and on the same L2 domain? Do I have to move VMs to the vCenter where HCX is deployed and L2 stretched?
No, so vCenter, you can move. The whole point of vCenter is, or the HCX manager pairing to vCenter is to collect all the data and inventory. So if you have a linked domain, you're still going to have multiple vCenters. The linked domain is covering your SSO, but the actual vCenter inventory is still specific to the vCenter. So you'd still need an HCX manager for each vCenter. In terms of migrating them, I guess basically yes, the migration occurs from the source vCenter. You would deploy appliances in that vCenter. Now, one thing to note is that you don't have to have the HCX manager in the same location as where all the appliances are. So the HCX interconnect appliance and layer 2 concentrators will be deployed in the target vCenter, because that's where the actual data path is going. But the manager itself could be located anywhere. Normally you'd run it in the same vCenter, but there's no reason to. So if you have a management cluster that you're not migrating any workloads, and that's where you put all your management appliances, certainly you could deploy your HCX manager there, run it in terms of where it's running, but then you would connect it. And when you log into the UI and say connect it to a vCenter, you would connect it to the vCenter where the actual VMs are managed by. So it always has to be paired with the vCenter where your workloads are running that you want to migrate.
So there's another question that popped up too here is, are there any other options if I do not want to use L2 extensions?
Yeah, L2 extension is only required for the scenario where you need to maintain the same network between two sites. So if you're doing live migration, typically you don't want to stop your network because that defeats the purpose of a live migration. So general is required for live migration. Not strictly speaking, if you're okay with being able to remap IP addresses as part of a migration and update any DNS pointers and clear all the DNS caches and have everything update, then you could theoretically update IPs as well, and have that migration, and then you don't need to stretch your networks. But if you're doing a cold migration, then or even a bulk migration, HCX also does have the capability, and we'll get to this when we cover the types of migrations. It has the capability of remapping IPs, and if you're doing a bulk migration where the VM actually does a reboot as part of the migration, or a cold migration where the VM is powered off for the duration of the migration, there's no need to have a layer 2 extension because you could remap it to a different network. Or if you're doing if you have small networks or networks with a small number of workloads on them, and you want to move the entire network at once, which you could do for up to probably anywhere from 50 to 100 VM maximum, you could potentially migrate that entire network in one shot using bulk migration. And then you don't need to have a layer 2 extension in all those scenarios. So it's not an absolute requirement, but if you're doing a live migration, it's pretty unlikely, except in some really specific cases, that you would be able to get away without it. All right. Just going to jump ahead a little bit. So let me talk about the different types of migrations. That's really what I want to get to. So let me just skip some slides. Talked about path enough. All right. So got some practices for successful migrations. So migrations have a lot that goes into them. There are a lot of planning, and the more you plan, the more success you're likely to have. We had the quote. I don't know if it's on one of these slides, but this is where we often hear the quote is failure to plan is planning to fail. So it's a little strong, but not totally inaccurate either. So part of the migration planning is around grouping your workloads. So you need to understand what your workloads are. You need to understand the connectivity, the requirements. What do they need? What are the business requirements in terms of when these workloads can migrate? What the impacts of them can be? I talked earlier about the latency specific applications that require very tight connectivity or very talkative between workloads. You really need to understand that connectivity in order to have a successful migration, because otherwise you're just guessing, and you might guess right, things might be fine, or you might end up splitting a database and an application that are very talkative and highly dependent on each other, and now you're sending a ton of bandwidth across this layer 2 stretch, or even across your layer 3 VPN or whatever connectivity you're using if you're not changing IPs, or if you are changing IPs, and your application can't keep up and your users report slow performance. So it's really important to understand this ahead of time. Typically, the best way to do that is using vRealize Network Insight. It's great at mapping flows. It's often used for understanding firewall connectivity requirements, but it's also really good for planning a migration, because you could see what applications talk to each other, how much they talk to each other. It even has the ability to help you determine which workloads or which VMs are actually part of the same application. It has some nice little views that allow you to determine that if you don't know. So if you've inherited an environment, or you have a legacy environment that nobody's really managed for a while and kind of had some VM sprawl, this will help you figure out what VMs go with which application. And it's really recommended for any kind of significant migration, even good for smaller migrations, because you'd be better off knowing in the planning stages what your connectivity and communication requirements are than finding out after you've moved it and when you're handcuffed and you're trying to be reactive to get workloads up for your users. So planning is really key. We do offer professional services that have done a lot of these migrations for pretty big customers and have a lot of experience in doing migrations, and they can apply that that methodology to migrating with HCX as well. So some of the considerations for how you plan your migrations are what applications do you group together. Are there some that you want to move first, some that you want to move last? Do you want to unstretch networks? Do you want to stretch networks for the duration? All all those points that need to be considered when you're migrating workloads and planning your groups. Also, size. It's important to understand the resources for your VM. So you could start usually with an export of RV tools or any kind of export of an inventory of all your workload VMs, including their resources. So how much memory, how many CPUs, how much disk space, because the disk space is what has to be copied over, and that will determine how long they take to migrate. Good to know change rates too, if you can get that data, because that tells you how long potentially a VM is going to take to sync, and whether it might be a good candidate for a live migration type option, like a replication assisted vMotion, where the data is synced using vMotion, so you need to track all those changes. So the more information you can get about your workloads, the better decisions you'll be able to make, and the better groups you'll be able to make for your migration. So let's talk about the different options that HCX can support for migrating workloads. This nifty little table here sums up the different options. So the first one here that is least used is cold migration, and the reason it's least used is because basically your VM is inaccessible for the entire duration of the migration. So you power it off, copy all the data, change whatever settings you need if you need to change networks or IPs or anything, and then you bring it back online. So depending on how large the data is and how fast your network connection, this could take quite a while. It could even be days. So it's fine for if you have standby VMs or replicas, or if you have VMs that are in multi availability groups that you can spare, take a VM out of service and you have other ones that can take up the load, then that's a perfect type of migration for that case. But for most customer workloads, it's just not going to cut it. And so then we get into these two types of migration groups here, bulk and vMotion. So in the bulk migration, this is a really interesting feature, and this is where we see the vast majority of migrations are done using bulk migration. And what it is it sets up replication. So you pre-stage your migration. You select up to 100 VMs. It's on the larger side, but that's basically the maximum limit, and you replicate them. And so it copies all the data over. Basically, it uses vSphere replication, the same engine that we use for DR. It copies the data over to the cloud, and it maintains it on an ongoing basis once it's completed. So if you have a 100 gig VM, it will copy all those 100 gigs, and then periodically, like every 15 minutes, it will track changes and it'll update any changes and synchronize them. So you're never more than 15 minutes out. And it keeps that maintained for as long as you want. In fact, when you set up the migration, you could even set up a target window for when it should cut over. And it'll just keep every 15 minutes, keep that data up to date. And then when you hit the target migration window, which you can edit, it will power down the VM at the source, do a final data sync, make sure that everything is exactly the same on both sides, switch over to VM, register it with the Cloud vCenter, and then it'll power up the VM in the cloud. It also has the ability to run any scripts that you provide using guest customization, so that this is where you would be able to do things like change the IP address, or if you have some kind of inventory tracking system or a CMDB that you need to now update saying, hey, this VM is now in a different place, you could run scripts to do that as well. HCX can facilitate all of that and coordinate it all, and your VM is moved to the cloud. And you could schedule this also. Technically, you don't even have to be watching. You just set it up and it goes when it's ready. So this is great because it allows you to synchronize the migration of multiple VMs at the same time. So if you have an application with 50 VMs in it, and you're wondering, well, how am I going to deal with all these VMs need to talk to each other, and they all are very talkative, they need to be together. I can't split them up. Well, that's fine. That's when you use bulk migration, because you've pre-staged all the data, the actual migration time is very short. We call it often reboot to cloud, because it shuts down, does this short sync up, which typically is only a couple of minutes, depends on the rate of change in the last 15 minutes, but ultimately it's only synchronizing 15 minutes worth of data, plus time to register the VM, and then it's just a reboot. So it's a really fantastic option for moving large amounts of VMs. And whenever you see the success stories of customers who have migrated thousands of VMs in a short time, the majority of their migrations are going to have been done through this bulk migration. Um, so that's the one you want to spend the most time understanding. It gives you the most flexibility to keep your groups together. And this is why the whole concept of groups comes into play, because this allows you to make groups and move groups of workloads at the same time. Whereas when you look at the vMotion options, that's where you are stuck doing basically single VMs at a time. You migrate one workload, it copies, it finishes. You migrate the next workload, it copies, it finishes. And so you're constantly migrating, but you're only doing a single VM at once. And so in that interim state, you have VMs that are on opposite sides of the cloud, let's say, if the cloud is a multi location place. The other bulk migration that's a newer feature is called bulk with OS, or sorry, not this one. I was thinking of the Vmotion one. Bulk with OS Assisted Replication. So OS Assisted Replication is a newer feature of HCX. I'm not overly familiar with it, so I won't really talk about it, but this is what you would use when you have VMs that are not vSphere based. So if you've got workloads in other environments, HCX has a feature that is works at the guest OS level, and it's kind of like combining converter. If any of you remember that, where it actually installs on the guest OS, doesn't require any underlying hypervisor coordination, and it copies the data and through the guest OS. So that's the other kind of bulk migration that is now available. The vMotion option. So I kind of described both of those already, but vMotion is the single-threaded, just like regular vSphere vMotion, except it's doing it over the cloud. So you do have the benefits of all that WAN optimization, where it compresses, it dedupes, so it dramatically reduces the amount of data that it has to send. But it gives you a live vMotion, which is pretty neat to the cloud for a single VM. But it's not the way you're going to evacuate an entire data center. It's great for one-off. So if you're in that ongoing hybrid mentality where you've got two sites and you have workloads running in each, this is probably what you'll be using, because you're going to move one VM here, one VM there, and this will allow you to do that without any interruption, as long as you have the underlying network connectivity, the layer 2 stretch. But again, it's single VM, so it's not a mass migration tool. The bottom one, bulk migration with replication assisted vMotion, which I think has now been renamed to HCX migration with vMotion, something along those lines. We like to rename things. So what this does is it combines the two. It combines bulk migration with the advantage of pre-staging your data and being able to group workloads to migrate together with the seamless live migration of vMotion. And so what it does is it does exactly the same thing as bulk migration did, where it uses vSphere replication to synchronize the data and then keep it fresh every 15-minute delta. And then instead of doing a power off and an offline sync and a reboot, it uses vMotion just for that final sync. So it's very good for most VMs, but there are some VMs where this is a challenge. And I mentioned earlier, you have to understand the rate of change, so the I/O rate of VMs. If you have very active VMs like database servers, it's quite possible that the rate of change is faster than the WAN network can support. Keep in mind, the WAN, even if you have lots of bandwidth with 10 gig links, you still have latency that's added on. WAN links are just never the same as your LAN connections that you use for vMotion within your data center. So anytime you have a busy database server, chances are good that it won't be able to keep up over the WAN, and the vMotion stage will fail. And in those cases, that's where you fall back to using the regular bulk migration, where you have to schedule a brief maintenance window. So that's an important consideration. Although the vMotion part sounds great, you get all the advantages of bulk, all the advantages of vMotion, there are still some limitations, and the failover is more intensive, because when the VM is off, it's not generating any changes. So that final true up with bulk migration can happen more quickly, whereas with vMotion, there's more overhead to initiate, to sync up, and to track all the I/O changes that are going on since the even since the vMotion started. So it depends on your workload whether that
Yeah,
will be viable.
and I'll just add in here too, Michael, that the technology is there, obviously, as you can see here, to do all of this stuff live. But sometimes it's easier just to do the cold migration as well. And we find, at least my personal experience, and maybe yours is the same, where sometimes we just ask the business they're okay with, a few hour outage on a weekend kind of thing. Just because you can do it live doesn't mean you have to or necessarily should do it live. And sometimes, like I said, the business is just okay with taking it offline, and it'll make things easier.
Absolutely, and that's exactly why there are all these different options available, is to address different business needs and different technology needs. And so this is where the migration planning that I talked about and understanding your workloads really comes into play, because it allows you to map your VMs to the right migration type for what your needs are. Uh, so get more into some samples of how you plan migrations. Uh, there are a few key factors around how you build your groups. So there's one which we've talked about, is the connectivity requirements to other workloads. So those database and application servers that are highly dependent on each other, uh, you know, Active Directory servers that are handling a lot of authentication. You don't want to have those far away latency wise, things like that. And this is where you determine your move groups based on applications typically. But that's not the only factor. So when you're doing your actual data replication, you need to look at what we call the longest pole in the tent. So if you think, I've got this application, it's got a database, 4 application servers, and 8 web servers. Um, I'll just move it all at once. It's not that many servers. That's great. Your web servers are 40 gig disk each. Your application servers are 200 gigs disk each. Then you get this database server that's 25 terabytes of disk. Well, you figure, well, hey, I'm doing weekly migration, so I'll just set it up and migrate. You calculate the total amount of data. Yeah, it should fit with my link. If you calculate the average throughput, maybe you're getting a gigabit per second of throughput across your pipe, which is a pretty typical value actually, because there are a lot of bottlenecks. Another point which I kind of accidentally stumbled to, but I do want to share, is how much bandwidth you could expect. And I think there was a question that was leading towards this earlier. Uh, you your bandwidth is going to depend on a number of factors. Storage on-prem is often a factor. Um, the any other network bottlenecks that are in your on-prem environment, your ESX host, how busy they are. If you're running backups they're sharing load, because you're sharing all this load with everything else that's running. So you need additional capacity, and there could be a lot of choke points. And then there are the appliances themselves and the WAN optimizers that need to process all that data and do the dedupe on it. And they do a fantastic amount of dedupe. And in fact, so much so that we often end up with customers looking at their WAN and saying, well, hey, like I've hardly seen any traffic on here. But when you actually calculate the overall migration times, they're still pretty good. And if you look at the WAN optimizer itself, you can see the network traffic in vCenter, and you look at the in and the out, and it's phenomenal, the difference. Like it's not uncommon to see over a gigabit of traffic going into the WAN optimizer, and only 250 megabits coming out. So you can
Just
say,
to touch real quick on that WAN opt, and you kind of mentioned it briefly, but it's good to run this on the fastest storage you have available.
yeah, very good point. So it's doing this all this dedupe. It needs to maintain a really decent disk cache, because it's got to read from that a lot. So yeah, you definitely don't want to put any of the HCX appliances, especially the WAN opt, on slow storage. Don't chuck that on your old NAS or something. Think that it's fine, because you'll just end up bottlenecking your migration performance, and it won't help you at all. You may even be better off without a WAN optimizer. But it definitely can reduce the amount of traffic that you're pushing through significantly. And the other thing to consider is, even if you have a 10 gig pipe, if that pipe is already in use, if it's not dedicated for the migration, it's not going to have all 10 gigs available to it. So how much does it have left? And in addition to that, you're also probably sharing that same bandwidth for your layer 2 stretch. So how much traffic are you pushing over that layer 2 stretch once you've got some VMs already migrated? So all these things are factors in how much throughput you can get. So you need to migrate a few workloads as tests, see how they do. But one of the key things that I was getting at before I sort of diverged to explain this is the migration gets really good throughput with parallelism, but you still have that longest pole in the tent. So back to our example of, these handful of VMs plus the one really large database server. So if you set up those replications and you wait for them to finish so that you could actually do the cutover, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with, the web servers are going to finish all really quickly because you get great parallelism. The dedupe really helps there because you're assuming your web servers are probably very similar. A lot of the data is going to be the same. Application servers take a bit longer, they're bigger, but still finish within maybe a day, 2 days. And then you get this database server that's going to sit there and it's going to be a single thread running. So you no longer have any advantage of parallelism. Your dedupe is probably negligible on a database. Maybe you get some, but probably not a ton. There's still other optimizations that happen, but ultimately what happens is you're calculating your overall migration based on the full parallelism, and you're ending up with 90% of your time waiting for this one VM to finish. And that's a common mistake we see with planning migrations, is not paying attention to the size of the workload. And so we really recommend that you look at the size of workloads and understand that for best efficiency, you want to maintain the size of your workloads in a migration group as close as possible to each other, because that ensures you get the maximum parallelism. All your migrations run at the same time and finish around the same time. Whereas if you have like a bunch of small VMs and a couple of really big VMs, those big VMs are going to end up sitting there running without any of that parallelism for potentially a very long time. And that's what we were pointing out in this slide around the long pole. So some other considerations to have. So network bandwidth, what talks to each other, how the size of the VMs, and then we talked about earlier, choosing the right type of migration for the right type of workload. So busy database servers that are running a lot of I/O probably going to have a hard time synchronizing, or certainly if they do synchronize, it's going to take a lot longer than something that's really quiet and not doing a lot of I/O. So I mentioned, typically the way you start is by pulling out an inventory. So you want to build up your application inventory, collect all the data. What are its resources? How much data is it used? What are the largest disks? Because again, the parallelism works across multiple disks, so it's important to track the largest disk. Track all the connectivity information, the dependencies, what databases is it using, just so that you can understand what to group together. And then all this will factor in to building your groups. And this is where you start bundling them into different waves. And this is always on the technical aspect, but I mentioned earlier on as well, it's really important to understand that a lot of the migration planning and waves and when things go are determined by your business requirements. Different business units will have different dependencies. Finance is not going to want to go at the end of quarter or end of month, for instance. Manufacturing may have certain times when they can't go because they're working full time. Different business units have different requirements, and it's really important to understand those upfront so that you don't end up leaving all of one business unit's workloads to migrate and then find out that, oh, this is their busy season. They won't let us migrate for the next 3 months because we managed to hit their busy season, and now your whole migration schedule is completely out of whack because you didn't plan around that. So it's really important to start with the business factors. Don't ignore those. The technical stuff is great. We can put it in spreadsheets, but you want to capture your business requirements somehow in those as well.
All right, so just a little bit of a time check there, Michael. I want to make sure that we had a little 5 minutes at
Yep.
the end, I guess, if we had any questions. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to touch upon real quick.
No, it's perfect, Matt. I was actually just going to say
Oh, perfect.
some examples of some of the spreadsheets here that we use that our professional services has built to help plan all these, and just some points to things that you can consider. and look at them so that you can get your waves planned and migrate effectively. But that's basically what I wanted to cover today.
One thing I just thought of, we do have that share available still that we did for VMworld. Maybe we could pop that up in the chat.
Sure. Let me
Yeah.
pull up
So for those that
slide.
aren't aware, we Michael and I and Andrea and Mitesh from our PSO and PSC teams did a session, 4-hour workshop at both VMworld EMEA and US, where we went a little bit pretty in depth into this, and there's the link at the top there. Bear in mind it is case sensitive, but you can go there. So some of the guides and the spreadsheets that Michael just showed are there, as well as the full presentation that we did at VMworld EMEA, which was the last one we did, where we did a little bit of cleaning up of the presentation. So absolutely go there for some more very useful material to help with your migration planning. Because as Michael touched upon, uh, the technology part is actually pretty easy. Setting up HCX and getting all that stuff configured is not all that difficult. Where the difficulty comes, or where the challenge comes, is in that migration planning that he went over pretty in depth, and negotiations with business groups and figuring out which parts of the application stuff. That's the hard part. The easy part's a little bit of the technology, and the stuff that's available there will definitely help with that.
Yeah, so there's some great resources around VMC. So starting from how you deploy your SCDC, which we weren't covering as a topic today, but the resources are there. A lot of links to the things that are helpful for planning, for operating, for managing, building, deploying an SCDC. Some links, some selected blogs and documentation within VMware. And then there are some templates. So all these spreadsheets that I was showing screenshots of, some sample spreadsheets are actually in there. So you can go pick them up and just give you a head start onto what data you need to collect. Each scenario is going to be slightly different. You know your business users if you're migrating. So the IT teams are the best resources. Listen to them. Know your business users and figure out what you need to capture. But the templates that are there will give you a really good start for the basics that you need to capture if you don't have anything else to go on. And then you could always add it and customize it as your particular environment requires. But if you don't know where to start, uh, go there. I know we had a lot to cover. I didn't get into all the details about how you install HCX, but there are some good documents as well that talk about how to get that set up, IP addresses, and review the presentation, and it'll cover some more of those as well. So, and feel free to hit any of us up for questions. Matt's really good about answering questions anytime you ask him. Right, Matt?
I do try. Yeah. So it also, if you're watching on Twitch, but if you're in the Zoom, we both have Twitter accounts. So I'm at VCloudMatt. Michael is at Classic Technica. You can tweet at us at any time. We'll answer questions. We do have an email address, cloudcs@vmware.com. Like I said, you put any chat questions in the chat right now as well. This video will also go up to YouTube afterwards. If you are watching this on YouTube, you can feel free to add a comment if you have additional questions there, and we do get to those as well. We want to ensure that everybody has as much information as humanly possible out there, and Michael did a fantastic job. Thank you, Michael, for doing this. I know I hit him up kind of last minute for it. HCX, like you talked about, is quite a core component of the VMware Cloud solution, which I guess we didn't really cover, but it is included for free to migrate to and from VMware Cloud. There is also an enterprise version that lets you migrate to other clouds as well, but that is a paid for service. But this is included for free with VMware Cloud. So this is something that no additional charge or any kind of licenses or anything. You just activate it in the portal, and away you go. So I don't see any other questions here, so I suppose we can wind it up and give everybody a little bit of time back. Like I said, I appreciate everybody for coming out. I really appreciate Michael for doing this. This will be available on YouTube. We are doing another webinar in 2 weeks' time. I believe that one's on SQL on VMware Cloud. If not, that one's coming up soon. Anyway, we do have webinars planned out till the end of the year. and then we're going to go from there. I think there is a poll here I can maybe start launching as well, just for everybody to get your feedback. We do welcome all feedback. If there's any other topics you want us to cover in webinars, absolutely let us know and we will cover it. We do twice weekly office hours as well, for those that aren't aware, available on Twitch, and there is a Zoom for it as well. I was actually just preceding this one, so Tuesdays at 8 a.m. Pacific time for our Americas and EMEA audiences, and I believe it's Tuesday in Australia time, and I'm not exactly sure of the time. It's 7 o'clock Monday night for in Pacific time for our APJ audience, which I'm not sure exactly when that works out to be, but I believe it's Tuesday morning in the APJ region. So absolutely, if you have any questions for anything involving VMware Cloud, actually anything really involving VMware for the most part, feel free to drop into any of those. They're very open format, and you can have all of your questions answered in that. So with that, again, like I said, I'd like to thank Michael Kolos, fantastic overview of HCX, and thank you everybody for joining up.
Thank you.